Has been preaching on some Old Testament characters, and so I checked with him, make sure this wasn't on his docket, and he said it wasn't, so that I'd go ahead with it, and I'll just kind of give you a little bit of a explanation maybe why we're going to the book of Esther. So I was blessed to be in Grenada last week and worship there in the little church there, and there were some visitors there, so it was from the States and plus the locals, and so it was full, and enjoyed the singing in that church, and just the whole service was really encouraging. But they had asked me if I would teach the men's Sunday school class, and I don't know when it was since I've taught Sunday school. It's been a long time. It made me more nervous than preaching a sermon because I haven't been used to it for a while. And so they're going through the book of Esther, and so the one chapter that they had asked me to cover a chapter. I'm not going to actually do that this morning, but while I was studying for that and looking through the book of Esther, there are some characters here in this book that different things stuck out to me about them, and partly because at times I could see myself in some of them, and I want us to think about that this morning. Some of the characteristics of these characters may come out in us, whether good or bad. There's some really good things from some of these, and there's some that are not so good. And so as we go through these and look at them, the point is not just to look at them, but I want us to look at ourselves. Do I sometimes react or act like they do, or they did? And I also hope that for some of the things regarding Esther and Mordecai, that we can be challenged to be more like some of the things that they did. So that's the purpose of the message this morning, because I was challenged looking at some of these people when I was studying for this. First of all, I would like to remind us that the Jews that were here in Persia at the time of Esther could have left. If you go back to the book of Ezra, you'll see that they went back to rebuild the temple. Later they go back and rebuild the wall. But there's millions of them here. But I think, if I remember correctly, maybe about 50,000 had went back at the most, the time of Ezra. So they're here somewhat on their own choosing. In the opening this morning for Sunday school, Gerald read there a couple things from Jeremiah, and the one there was, I know the plans I have for you and so forth, and talked about visiting you in 70 years and so forth. But one of the things that was told them was, when you go there, when you're taken captive and you're taken away, when you get there, build houses, plant gardens, be good citizens, do your thing there. And they did, and many of them did it well enough they decided to stay. And later, probably during this time, some of them, for at least for a period of time, were thinking, was that a wise choice or not? But things did work out, as you know, from the book of Esther. But they did have that opportunity. Also, keep in mind that the king here, Ahasuerus, would have known a considerable amount about the Jews. Even when he let Haman talk him into destroying them, it wasn't as though he didn't know who they were. You'll notice you can find his family's names in the book of Ezra, also in Daniel. You'll see father, son, family. They were connected. They knew who these people were. It's not as though he was completely just oblivious to who the Jewish people were in his kingdom, scattered throughout all his provinces. So he would have been aware of that. The other thing to keep in mind is Haman was, it would appear, was a descendant of the king of the Amalekites, Agag, who Saul was supposed to completely destroy. If you go back into 1 Samuel 15 and look at that. And he didn't destroy Agag. Now, Samuel did, the Bible says, basically hacked him to death because of all the evil he had done. So I'm not sure how this works out, but most scholars would believe that Haman was a descendant of his. And so I don't know that I'll mention this later, but the fact of the matter is that basically Esther and Mordecai had to do what Saul was supposed to do a long time ago, and that was take care of him and his sons. As you'll see, if you read the whole book of Esther, you'll see that him and his sons were executed. So, having said that, kind of as a preface here to the message, first guy I want to talk about is the king. And the first thing that I noticed about him when I was going through was the fact that he seems to have an anger problem. He gets angry quickly. And I don't know if you can, if that's something you struggle with or not. If it is, you need to work on it. Let's go, and I'm not going to read long sections of Esther. We'll read a few sections here and there. But in chapter 1, verse 2, it mentions him there, who he was and so forth. And if you go over to chapter 2 and verse 1, this is after his queen didn't show up when he wanted her to. It says, after these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So basically it's saying he remembered what happened and his wrath from the king and what he was angry about. Earlier in the chapter it talks about, over in verse 12 of chapter 1, but when the queen Vashti refused to come to the king at the king's commandment by his chamberlains, therefore the king was very wroth. He was very angry, and his anger burned in him. He was not a happy camper that his queen didn't show up to show off her beauty like he wanted her to. And so you can see that. If you go over to chapter 7, verse 7, and this is after Esther had set up this banquet so she could show who wanted to destroy the Jews and so forth. And it says, and the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make a request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So here the king was angry. And then you go down into verse 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was pacified. Okay, so they hang him, and now he's not quite as angry anymore. So the king had an anger problem. And how are we? Can we be that same way, where if things don't quite go our way, or somebody doesn't do what we ask them to do, or something happens that's out of our control or we didn't expect, then suddenly we're angry. And then once we get our way, or we deal with someone, or we retaliate, then our wrath is appeased. Is that how, can we be that way? I hope not. I hope we're forgiving people. That's what we need to be. He was also easily influenced by others. And you can see that regarding the whole thing with Queen Vashti, where he was like, they were saying, hey, if she got by with this, just think about the fact that all the other women in the whole country, all the rest of the women are going to start disrespecting their husbands. And so he asked, well, what shall we do? And they said, well, you better banish her, don't ever see her again. And so he was influenced by that. He was also influenced regarding the Jews. And the reason I'm bringing this up is we can fall into this to where other people influence us to do things, and we don't stand on our own 2 feet. We don't go back to the Word of God and see for sure what the Word of God says. We can be influenced easily to do things. And I think we live in a culture where there's a lot of influence from the world around us. We can be influenced by worldly things. We can also be influenced. Social media is a very influential tool today, in my opinion. That's often used wrongly. And so you have that kind of pressure to influence us. Some people are influenced easily because they just want to be loved, they want to be liked, they don't want to go against anyone or so forth. And so are we a little bit like the king at times? So in chapter 3, verses 8 to 11, it says, and Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them or to allow them to even continue to be there. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of this business to bring it into the king's treasuries. In other words, we're going to take all their spoil and you're going to get it. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, and the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Go ahead, wipe them out. Influence just because Haman comes and said, hey, they're not really following your laws that well, and they're kind of a different group of people, so it'd be good if we just destroyed them. Okay, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead and do that. He was also influenced regarding Mordecai. It seems like he couldn't make too many decisions on his own, considering the fact that he was the king of all these provinces and so forth. When Haman came into his chambers, after he had found out that that Mordecai had saved his life, basically, and he asked Haman, we'll just read it, chapter 6, verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to honor more than myself? And so Haman answered him, and he gives him these ideas about putting him on a horse and arraying him in fine apparel and all this stuff and prancing him through the city and everything. And okay, let's do that. Let's go ahead and do it. Again, influenced by others rather than saying, you know what, somebody saved my life. What should I do to honor this person? And actually thinking through it. He was influenced with regard to the hanging of Haman then. In chapter 7, verse 9, it says, and Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. He didn't come up with the idea. Somebody else said, well, hey, Haman made this gallows 50 cubits high. That's about 75 feet tall. I'm not sure, by the way, other than the fact that you really want everybody to see what's going on, why you need to make a gallows quite that tall. One much shorter will do the same thing. But let's build one about the height of a silo, these old silos, which most people don't have anymore. And let's build a gallows that high so we can chuck him off from there, and that ought to take care of it. But anyway, that's what they suggested doing. And so he did it. Another thing about the king before we move on from the king, and we had already looked at this basically, but if you go over to chapter 3 again in verse 9, you will notice that through all this thing of destroying the Jews, basically what they're planning to do is take the spoil from the Jews and bring it into the king's treasury, and he's going to get rich. He had a desire for money. His desire for wealth overtook his clear thinking that we're going to get rid of all the Jews for me to get this wealth. And I think maybe of all of the king's problems here, his desire for influence, his anger problem, and so forth, we can fall into the idea of a desire for wealth, and sometimes maybe not the idea of actually destroying people to get wealth, but will we sometimes trample over people or take advantage of people, or maybe even bend our own integrity to get wealth because we want to have money. So maybe that's a problem that you would have a problem with. Let's move on to Haman. And he also had an anger problem. If you go over into chapter 3, verse 5, it says, and when Haman saw Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. He was angry. He had an anger problem too. King wasn't the only one in the kingdom that had an anger problem, and obviously it's still a problem and can be a problem for each one of us. Another thing that was a problem for Haman in chapter 6, verse 6, we read this, I'll read it again, is he was proud and conceited. And this one, now these are getting a little more to where maybe they can come into our heart and we don't think about it as much. Maybe you don't have an anger problem, you wouldn't get angry at people, but maybe you're proud about the fact that you don't have an anger problem. And of all the people that have a good attitude, it must be me, that kind of thing, proud and conceited. Well, in chapter 6 it says, so when Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall the man do to whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to honor more than myself? Surely, he's talking about me. The king wouldn't want to honor anyone else more than me. Well, he did. And it wasn't Haman. But he was conceited, and he was proud. He also had a desire to be honored and lifted up. Let's go back to chapter 3. I'll read the first 6 verses. And after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. So the king had told everybody, you need to bow when Haman comes through. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So it wasn't enough when he wasn't honored the way he wanted to be to just get rid of Mordecai. I'm going to get rid of all their people. Just kill them all. Get rid of them. So what it was is he was vengeful. And you'll also see that he was getting money out of this. He was greedy. He had greed for money and power, and he was vengeful. No, my question is this, to bring this down to everyday living. If you don't get the honor or respect from someone that you would like to have, and obviously for us, I don't think anybody here wants to see people bow down and honor them, or we walk into church, or you walk into a business, or you walk into your house as the father. You don't want to see your wife and children bowing down, okay? I hope not. If so, we got a real problem. But if you don't get the honor and respect from maybe you husbands, from your wife, or from your fathers, maybe from your children, or maybe even your wives, maybe you don't feel like your husband gives you the kind of honor you should have, or whatever it might be, or maybe it's a boss at work, you got employees, or if you don't get the respect that you think is coming to you, or as leaders in the church, if we don't get the respect that we think should be coming, what's our response to that? Well, I'll show them. Haman's response was vengeance. I will destroy them. Maybe that wouldn't be your response, but maybe your response would be, well, fine. They're not going to give me the honor I deserve, then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll get them back. I'll show them. Well, I hope this happens to them. Serves them right. We can fall into these traps probably a little easier than maybe we think we can. Haman was also a conniver. He offered money to get rid of the Jews. And then, maybe you fall into this category. He was also a pouter when he didn't get what he wanted. If you go over to chapter 6, after he realized it wasn't him that was going to be honored, instead Mordecai, the person he wanted destroyed, verses 12 and 13 says, and Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hastened to his house mourning and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Okay, and so they went on to tell him what he could do and so forth. He was pouting about the fact that he didn't get his way. You think the fact that he was pouting had something to do with his attitude of being proud and vengeful, and all of a sudden it didn't work out. He couldn't do what he's going to do. And so he becomes a pouter. Maybe some of you, if you don't get your way or somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do, you don't get your way, then you're going to just pout. You're going to, maybe you don't actually pout like a child pouts, but you're going to show somebody. Maybe it's whatever way it might be. Well, let's move on to a couple of people that I think have a lot better characteristics, and one is Esther. And the first one I want to mention about her, she seemed to be an obedient person, especially to her authorities. In chapter 2, verse 10, it says that Esther had not showed her people, nor her kindred. For Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. In other words, when you get in here and you are among these people trying out, I don't think they were trying out, they didn't have a choice for queen. And if you become queen, don't tell them who you are. Do not tell the people that you're a Jew. Just be quiet about that. He had good reason for that. And so she had honored that. If you go down into verse 20, it says, Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. Esther obeyed Mordecai. He was the one that raised her. And so she had honored him, and she had listened to him, and she had followed what he had told her to do. It says, even as she was brought up with him, she was an obedient person. I hope that would be something that you would fall under, that someone who would respect and obey the authority in her life like Mordecai was. She also cared about people. She cared about Mordecai, for one thing. If you go to chapter 4, I'll read the first 4 verses. And this is after Mordecai had found out about the decree of killing all the Jews. It says, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And came even before the king's gate, for none might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree had came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him. But he received it not. Now this is interesting. At this point, I don't think Esther knew about the decree. I don't think she knew what Mordecai was mourning about. It would appear that maybe being sheltered in here in the castle or whatever it was, and not being out and exposed, she hadn't heard about this. All she knew that Mordecai, her cousin, was out here in sackcloth and ashes in a spot where he wasn't supposed to be, and he was going to get in trouble. So she sent clothes. Go take him, get the man clothes so he doesn't get in trouble. She cared about Mordecai. Well, Mordecai didn't receive the clothes. He said, no, I can't do this. And then he explained what was going on. And then we'll get a little bit more of that story later. But if you go also to chapter 8, verses 3 through 8, and this is after a lot of other things happen in this story, but the decree was still out there. And remember, these decrees, the Persia and the Medes, once the law was made, it was supposed to stay there. And so she's concerned that she could still, her kindred could still be killed. So in chapter 8, verses 3, and Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in the king's provinces, all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see this evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? And of course, he did change that. But she was concerned about her people enough that she went back to the king and was probably, again, at the possible disposal of her own self, because if he would have said, "Why are you here again? I did this once. You're destroyed for coming here." And so she risked her life again to go for her people. She was also courageous. And in chapter 4, verses 15 through 17, and this was after she had explained to Mordecai that if I go into the king, and if anybody goes into the king and he doesn't hold out the golden scepter, they could be killed just for showing up, me too. And Mordecai explained that it was important that she did that. And then it says, then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer: go, gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. And I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. She was courageous. If I perish, I perish. Are we willing to, the Sunday school lesson touched on this, would we be willing to go to death for others to save these people? If I perish, I perish. She was a courageous person. I hope you have courage like that in the face of opposition and danger. She was also willing to fast for 3 days, neither eat nor drink, and she encouraged others to do so as well. It's interesting. I've often heard it said that Esther commanded that everyone pray and fast for 3 days before she goes in unto the king. Did you know that prayer is not mentioned, I don't think, in the book of Esther anywhere? It's not mentioned here. It just said fast. I don't think God is referenced, but the actual name for God is never in the book of Esther. Neither is the word prayer, I don't believe. Just fast. Now, we could possibly assume that she was praying and wanted prayer. Or was it simply a fact of a little bit like Mordecai and sackcloth and ashes, just showing before God, the lamenting before God, the need for God's help? We would hope they were praying as well, but she was willing to fast for 3 days. And I don't know how many of you have ever fasted for 3 days, but if you have, some of you probably have. That's one thing not to eat for 3 days. It's another thing not to eat or drink for 3 days. It's actually a little dangerous, especially in that climate, probably where they were at. But that's what they did because she was so concerned about going into the king, and she wanted others to do this as well. And I can assume that they cried out to God, but Scripture actually does not say that. She also planned out her approach to show the king Haman's plan. She put together that whole idea of the banquets and so forth and thought that out very well. So there's a number of things about Esther that I think are important for us, characteristics that we should have. The idea of obeying authorities, those that, especially like for Mordecai, that raised her, care about other people, being courageous, and willing. For us, it should be willing to pray and fast for others. Now we're going to look at Mordecai yet, and I would say he was a man of integrity. And I hope that this would be something that we could fit into. He was a man of integrity. He would not bow to Haman. He would worship God, but not man. And that was the whole thing about it. He would worship God, but not man. And bowing down to Haman would have been, in a sense, showing worship to a man. He was not willing to do that. Now, he did, however, respect his authorities or have a care about them. If you go to chapter 2, verses 19 to 23, I want to read that. It says, and when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai like as when she was brought up with him. And in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan, and boy, wouldn't you like to have that name, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth. and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. And therefore they were both hanged on a tree. And it was written in the book of Chronicles before the king. And I don't know, it doesn't actually say how much of a part the king played in this whole matter, but there was inquisition made and they were executed. It seems as though this could have been a problem at that time, people trying to rise up and overthrow a government or whatever. But when these guys tried it, they were removed from the gene pool fairly quickly, it looks like. But there was the thing that Mordecai probably didn't, I don't know that he really cared that much about the king personally, but yet he respected him enough that when he heard this, he told Esther about it so that something could happen. Now, there is another possibility here. It could be that he cared about Esther more than he cared about the king. Because had they actually been able to kill the king and take over, what would have happened to Esther? She may have been killed as well, and all the rest of those in there. So I'm not exactly sure, but it would look as though he did. It wasn't as though he sat back and thought, the king, I don't like him anyway. No, he respected his authorities enough, even if it wasn't someone that maybe he liked that much, but he put the word out and probably risked his own life to do that. He was unbending even in the face of death. He really was. He was unbending. It didn't matter. Haman could have had him killed just like that, but he would not bow to Haman. Unbending even in the face of death. Would that be me? I don't know. I don't know, but Mordecai was that way. He also cared about the people. And let's go to chapter 4, and we're going to read the first few verses there, first couple verses. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, and this was after that decree was sent out, and all the Jews are going to be killed, so forth. When Mordecai perceived what was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. I wonder what that was like. He went out and made this lamenting cry and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. He cared about what was going to happen to the people, and I suspect that Mordecai may have felt personally responsible for the demise of all the Jews that were in the kingdom. Millions of people. You know, if I would have, maybe I should have just bowed to Haman and been done with it, and all these people would be saved. I don't know if he thought that. Probably not, because he was unbending even in the face of death. But I suspect he probably had a sense of feeling of responsible for what was going to happen to all the Jewish people. And he cared about them. And he went to the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes. Again, he wasn't supposed to be there that way. If he dies, he dies. He cared about what was going to happen to these people. And then the other thing about him that I think is a characteristics of Mordecai that I would hope I could have, or at least get together somehow in my life, that I make sure this is where I'm at. Let's go on down in chapter 4 to verse 10. And Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. And all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whomsoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. By the way, ladies, how would you like that if your husband hadn't even wanted to see you for at least a month? Anyway, she hadn't been called in. They told to Mordecai Esther's words. Now listen to this. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. In other words, I think maybe one version might have said, don't flatter yourself to think you're going to survive if all the Jews are killed. And then he says, if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And that would have meant him as well. And who knoweth whether thou art come into the kingdom for such a time as this? So, Mordecai is telling Esther, you can hold your peace. But I'm going to tell you something. You and your father's house will be destroyed. God will not allow you to live if you're not willing to stand up for your people. However, God will provide a way to save the Jews. God will do it. So Mordecai trusted God to save the people even more than he trusted his cousin whom he had raised, Esther. He said, if you don't do it, just know this, you're going to be destroyed. I'll be destroyed. Your father's house, we're all going to be destroyed. However, God will provide a way to save his people, whether you do it or not. And that's something that I think we all need to learn, that, you know what? I thought about that regarding the church. It's not my church, and I'm talking about this church or the whole church as a whole. It's not my church. It's not your church. But the church of Jesus Christ, his bride, is going to survive, whether or not you are involved in helping. But I believe we're all called to the kingdom for such a time as this, to do whatever God has called you to do. And so I just want to encourage you, if you find yourself with some of those negative characteristics that we saw in the king and in Haman, get rid of those things, repent of those things, get them out of your life. And move over and pick up some of these other things that we saw in Esther and Mordecai, so that whatever God has called you to right now, into the kingdom for such a time as this, for you to do something, that you're willing to do it. But know this, that if you refuse to do what God has called you to do, it may hinder the work, but God's work is still going to go on. The church will continue. The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church, whether or not you or whether or not I do our part that he has called us to. But I want to encourage you to do your part just like Esther did. She said, okay, I'm going to fast for 3 days, and I'm going to do this. And if I perish, I perish. And may we all have an attitude like that I'm going to do what God has called me to do. If I perish, I perish. But I'm going to do this for God and for the work of the kingdom.